Okay, so the first step in writing this paper is you want to identify a knowledgeable family member who knows about your family history in your family. So some families have like the family historian, like your like an aunt or an uncle or your grandmother. And if you can get in touch with them, that would be great. So you want to interview this person. So to conduct an interview with a family member, and I know, this can be difficult, but any family member will do if you have access to them and they know a little bit about your family history. And even if they don't know about your family history, that can also be interesting. So kind of like talking about some of the roadblocks to knowing your family history, and that's also fine. There's like a trick in journalism. The story sometimes is how the story is how the story can be difficult, and so that's fine. So you want to conduct an interview. I was thinking by October 2nd, so in the next 3 weeks here. Conduct an interview with a knowledgeable family member, and prepare for the interview by formulating several questions about your family history. Are there any interesting stories in your family's past? How does your family's history connect to larger historical events, wars, changing borders of nation states? So please have some kind of recording device, preferably digital, video, or audio, but at the very least analog notes, so you could just write notes and then type them up later. That's fine. And I want to see an index of typed notes of the interview of these documents by October 2nd. So this is the first step, is who is this knowledgeable family member? And, formulate some questions. There's actually, I'll be talking more specifically about how to conduct the whole interview in another video. But for now, identify this knowledgeable family member and start to brainstorm like questions you might ask them about your family history. It's sometimes very interesting to dig up how your family's sort of what we call like more micro history, smaller history, intersects with more macro events. So the larger events so a lot of people of Irish descent, me included, my great great grandfather came to the U.S. because of the potato famine, right? In the 1890s, I believe, right? And so digging that up can be really interesting. What were the larger historical factors that participated in your family's migration story, right? Or larger events that have intersected with your family. So this is like the first-hand evidence for your paper, right? Is you're going to weave in some facts from this interview, quotations or tidbits of information from this interview for your paper. Well, I have a 2 there, but so that's the first step, is conducting this interview and writing up the notes. The second step, and a lot of people really like this, is you're going to do a photo analysis of a family photo from your family history. So you're going to find a photograph. It could be a picture that's meaningful to you and your family. It could be. It's usually better if there's a few people in it, I think. But it could also be like of a house or a place or an object that holds significance for you and your family. And you're going to write about it. So your first step is kind of to describe what's in the photograph, like what is going on in the photograph, right? So you could say like, who is in the photograph? What do you notice about the people in the photograph? And so talking about this photograph, you let's talk about like the backstories. This was taken at Christmas in 1995 or something like that. And then you kind of like move to this, how does it make you feel? Why is this photograph meaningful to you? And then you're actually going to include a digital copy of the photograph in this section of the paper. So I want you to scan it, right? Or at the very least, a picture of a picture. Sometimes it's not the best way to do it, but if you can actually include it in the paper, that'll be great. And there's a lot of good examples of this. Again, a Kindays essay, and then I'll also put up some old student essays that also do the family photo analysis, right? And so, yeah, this is actually really fun. If you want to, also you can include more than one photograph. I'm fine with that. And sometimes it's also good to include sort of a brief description of what's going on in a figure. So, have you ever been reading an essay and they go like figure one, my grandmother in 1982, right? And so if you can add those also help orient the reader to, oh, or like, oh, okay, that's a photo of a grandma, or that's a photo of her uncle, right? And to have that, um, those kind of orienting um, figures, they're called, they kind of go along with the pictures you include. That can be really helpful. And I'll show you an example of that. Now, the next step is I want you to discuss any subcultural rituals or practices that you participate in that reflect on your cultural identity. So, like, if there is some subcultural is interesting, like, because I was thinking, like, there's some dominant American culture, but maybe that's not the best way to ask that. But are there some sort of cultural practices that you participate in? So you could think about holidays, food, rites of passage. So like what are important moments in your family or in your cultural group? What days? Is it weddings? Is it graduations? Um, is there music associated with your identity? And and to reveal those, right? And to talk about those. If your family assimilated into American culture, go back into your history and make a claim about when or what point did your family become assimilated. So this can be very hard because, again, for the whole cultural thing, and if you grew up in a situation where you didn't see difference, right? So you're often like, oh, I don't have culture. We just do the regular things. We just do the quote unquote normal things. Try to back up and be like, well, what is normal things? What are normal holidays, right? And try to unpack that. What food does my family eat, right? And try to become more aware of that. So yeah, what are your practices? Yeah. So again, holidays, food, major moments of importance that are celebrated in your family. And you also think about like values, traditions, right? And what's celebrated, what's really celebrated in your culture or family group. And then the fourth part of the paper can be really fun. And I want you to reflect deeply on who you are. And you could even really open to lots of like creative forms when you do this. So thinking about this activity, how would you answer the question, who are you? This activity highlights the process of ascription, how others describe us, and avow, how you describe yourself. Yeah, so oftentimes there can be a tension between how we are ascribed an identity versus how we see ourselves. And so you can talk about that. For this paper, share the identities that you avow or claim. Discuss whether or not you have a sense of pride avowing your identity and your family history, following the vignette forms that Cisneros uses. This is actually not relevant for us, but you could write like, feel free to write, free form, poetry are all acceptable forms for me, particularly in this section. You can kind of think of it as like an I am poem. I'm open to that. You may want to include the in-class vignette about your name or reflections of where you grew up. You can also include your I am poem or statement, which we'll come to later. I'm very open to creative forms like poetry or even using metaphors. Following writers like poets like Cisneros and Ansel Dua, you should feel free to be creative in how you express yourself. Yeah, definitely. So this kind of like this deep reflection, can be really creative. I'm open to that. And yeah, that sort of ends the paper. I'd also like you to name the sections of each paper. So you want to have a good title for the whole paper, but also to have like subheadings for each of these sections. And again, I'll show you some examples of what this paper has looked like in the past from students who have already written their papers. So first step, you're going to interview a knowledgeable family member in the next few weeks, and you're going to type up some evidence of that, right? And you are going to do a photo analysis, scan that photo and include it in your paper. You're going to talk about any rituals or traditions that your family participates in and what's important in your family in terms of rites of passage and those sorts of things. And then you're going to reflect deeply on who you are. So it's about a 6-page paper. So maybe like, maybe you would include, so for the first section, by the way, this is going to become, so you're going to include you're going to prove to me that you conducted the interview by turning in some notes. But this section, when it becomes part of the paper, should actually be written in essay form. So it would be like highlights of the interview should be part 1. So, but it would be in essay form, and you can see that in the sample papers. So that's an overview of the 4 sections. Really quickly, here are some questions to guide your writing. How has history impacted your identity? Yeah, so what has been the role of history? Who were the immigrants in your family? How have intercultural relationships impacted your family? What has been your family's history of assimilation and separatism in the country, right? How has macro history impacted your microfamilial history? What cultural group histories have impacted who you are today, right? Like, so some people identify with diasporas, so like the African diaspora, and how the history of slavery, for example, or the spreading of African peoples all over the country today, or all over the world today, has impacted them, right? So you could talk about that. More terms to consider: cultural identity, positionality, standpoint theory, dialogue, reflection, culture as shared meaning, intersectionality, which we'll talk more about. Whiteness, yeah, whiteness is huge. So a lot of us have been affected by whiteness, which is this idea that, we're normal, or we don't have culture, or yeah. But it's actually a position of privilege, and so maybe becoming more aware of your privilege, right, could also be a part of the paper. Really open to that. Body politics, patriarchy, ascription about identity, ascribed identity, cultural space, hybrid cultural space, segregated cultural space, migrants and sojourners, silence history, social constructs, race, gender, class, sexuality, just to name a few. So we'll definitely talk more about all of these terms, and if they're relevant, right, how could you bring them into your paper? So that's a little bit more about the steps to writing the paper. Conduct the interview, and then you actually write this in an essay form as a section in the paper. Photo analysis, rituals and traditions, and reflect deeply.